Welcome back. Statistics South Africa has just released the numbers for the first quarter, unemployment numbers that is, for the first quarter of 2025. It reveals that the joblessness rate has increased by a percentage point from 31.9% to 32.9%. Let's bring in an economist at Stellenbosch Business School, Professor Roux. It's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. It might seem like a small edging up of the unemployment rate, but it does mean that more than 291,000 people are now without a job or were in the first quarter.
It means that It means unemployment has risen by, as you say, just short of 200,000, which obviously means that fewer jobs were created than those who were looking for jobs, which is not a new refrain. I think, you're quite right. The number has gone up slightly, but the point is it's been % or above since COVID. And it's been above 25% for many a long time, going back 20 odd years. And that's a really worrying thing. It remains chronically high. Whether the economy grows or not, it remains chronically high, which is telling us a number of things. One is that the unemployment here is mainly of what we call a structural nature. In other words, it's the result of deeply society and in the economy, not least of which inappropriate education and skills. So we find, for instance, that the youth unemployment rate for those aged 15 to 24 is in excess of 60%. I mean, that is almost obscene.
Sure.
For those aged 25 to 34, just over 40%. So it's telling us that the biggest victims of unemployment, those who are least able to pay, are younger members of society. And that alone is a worrying fact.
Yeah, and it goes some way to explain, sorry, I might have interrupted you there, but it goes some way to explaining why, 15 to 24, that age group, and we are a young country, right? The bulk of the population in South Africa is in the younger age group. But it goes some way to explain why more than 8 million people in the country are unemployed.
Absolutely. And just to add to that concern, there's an interesting concept, acronym NEETS, which stands for Not in Employment, Education or Training. Now, in this country, roughly 10 million South Africans are aged 15 to 24, of which more than, in fact, close to 4 million are NEETS. So they're not in education, not at school, not at university, not at college, and not working either. So one wonders what they are doing. That's an exceptionally high number. So as I say, it's a whole cobweb of so many interrelated forces causing unemployment. We add to that something else, and that is that people like to think that if the economy grows, then almost automatically more jobs will be created. It's not that simple. You can grow an economy by simply buying new machines and producing more goods. So economic growth per se doesn't guarantee job creation. In fact, one could all try to imagine an employer saying to him or herself, well, I want to expand my production and I have a choice. I can either employ more labor to do so, or perhaps buy a nice, big, clever machine. If I employ labor, and I don't have to, but if I do, then all kinds of laws kick in and I might get into trouble. But if I don't employ labor, I won't get into trouble. If I buy a machine, I won't get into trouble. And very often, I'm afraid that machine turns out to be very efficient and often even cheaper than employing labor, which brings us back to the question of why that is the case. And a big reason is productivity of our labor force is not very good and doesn't really grow because of inadequate, inappropriate education and skills.
Yeah, and it's difficult to discuss the issue of unemployment because it just is so wide-ranging in South Africa, right? If we look at what's being in the news lately about school feeding schemes, for example, who haven't been paid, and we think about the impact that has on learning outcomes in education, it goes back to the very basics of what we're struggling with in terms of service delivery in our country.
Absolutely. And, if one looks at both international and local studies on what they often call the predictors of success in education, then there are three which stand out. One is the quality of teachers. Second, the quality of school management. And thirdly, interestingly, parental involvement. And one could probably argue that any one of those are perhaps deficient in many instances in South Africa. The other thing I want to highlight, or not highlight, but also point out, is that globally, and it should be the same here, the fastest growing kind of employment is self-employment. And we think here of self-employment, people establishing their own little businesses, own little endeavors, and or small businesses. And we really want to make inroads into unemployment. One of the requirements is to really encourage self-employment entrepreneurship. Gone are the days where people work for one big organization from cradle to grave for 40 years. The whole labor market context is changing, has changed, will change. The kind of skills required are changing. The nature of work, whether it be temporary or permanent or somewhere in between, is changing. And I don't think we've caught up with that yet. We need to drag ourselves kicking and screaming into the 21st century in terms of education, training, skills development, etc. One final comment, if I may, at this stage, and that is, very interestingly, the highest unemployment rate, if you break our population down into different demographic groups, is amongst Black African women. The lowest is amongst white men. Now, that might sound counterintuitive if you think about labor laws. That's probably because more and more white men are doing what I just mentioned, and that is self-employed, not able to find jobs perhaps in government or elsewhere, but therefore going for self-employment. So it brings me back to the same recurring refrain. No one owes anybody a job. So in that case, you have to create your own job.
I wonder what you think about the kind of environment in South Africa that is needed to facilitate what you've just talked about. Globally, the fastest growing employment is entrepreneurship. Do we have an enabling environment in South Africa for entrepreneurs?
No, I'm afraid not. I mean, the failure rate of startups is horribly high. And the reasons for that are many. There's a multitude of reasons, ranging from inability to borrow a very modest amount of money, because banks and lending institutions tend to be, understandably, they tend to look for high returns or high interest rates for what they deem to be high risks. Then a small budding business might have a wonderful idea, but no business acumen. So again, I want to go back to education. I think we should be fostering business acumen, business training, basics at a very young age. Then another barrier is very often absence or lack of mentors who are willing and able to mentor young budding entrepreneurs. We need to add to all of this our legislation. It's not always easy, bureaucratically and otherwise, to get your business going and keep it going. We often find that a small business would like to employ more people, but they are not very well equipped to deal with the hassle factor which we find in our labor legislation. So we seem to almost pay lip service to the idea of entrepreneurship, and we don't always put our money where our mouths are. So I think we really need a concerted effort from not just government, but from all involved in really fostering and encouraging this entrepreneurial spirit. I'm convinced that this entrepreneurial spirit is bubbling just below the surface, waiting to explode and erupt. But it needs to be given that opportunity to explode and erupt.
And I think perhaps, Prof, just as a parting shot, that's such an interesting idea you're talking about. And I think part of that maybe even starts in the home, trying to get our children into early entrepreneurship. And you talked about parental involvement and how important that is in outcomes for young people. I just want your comment very quickly on the provincial unemployment statistics. The Western Cape and Gauteng saw the largest increases in employment in Q1, but the Northwest, incredibly worrying, the expanded unemployment rate in that province standing at 56%.
Yeah. Generally speaking, the Western Cape tends to have the lowest unemployment rate of our provinces, and then provinces like what you mentioned there, as well as Eastern Cape, tend to have exceptionally high unemployment rates. And that's all a function of all the things I mentioned before, distribution of population, age distribution, and the like. But yes, we certainly do find, I mean, one could almost argue, perhaps this is my parting words, that if we were to kind of profile an unemployed person, that person is probably more likely to be Black African, probably young, age 15 to 24, 15 to 35, probably does not have 12 years of education. Possibly, there's a slight bias in terms of female versus male unemployment, so possibly female, and probably lives in provinces like Eastern Cape, possibly and a few others. So I'm afraid we do have these distinctions. I want to add to where you almost started this conversation. Unemployment is far more than just being an economic concern. We know about inequality in South Africa. Unemployment is one of the biggest reasons for inequality. The gap between someone earning something, albeit peanuts, and someone earning nothing is an infinitely big gap. So unemployment is a major creator of inequality and naturally a major creator of poverty.